Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, as the case might be. My name is Teresa Murad, and I'm the Director of Education and Diversity Programs at the Ecological Society of America. So today, our topic is No Time for All Four Dimensions of Ecology Education. Which would you drop? And for today, we have a very lively, we're expecting a very lively, informal, and provocative water cooler chat. Again, if you've just joined us, please feel free to share your name, affiliation, and the course that you teach. Okay. So just for a little bit of an overview of how this water cooler chat works, this is totally informal. All your ideas and experience are welcome. And of course, please be respectful at all times. If you would like to join the conversation, please raise your hand, your digital Zoom hand, which can be found on the Zoom menu bar. And of course, feel free to post comments, share resources in the chat box at any time. We just ask you to keep your mic muted until we call upon you, and please follow the take space, make space principle. And I think you have already realized that we are recording this session, so feel free to turn off your video if you don't feel comfortable being viewed. Right, so today our host is Dr. Justin St. Juliana. He's Senior Lecturer at the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Cornell University. He's also a member of our 4DEE subcommittee, and he's been really active. He's also a peer mentor of one of our faculty mentoring networks. So we're really happy to have him host this chat. And I guess let's get started. So I'm turning to you, Justin.
Yeah, so thanks, Teresa. And this really isn't a formal presentation. I really am a host here, and I'm hoping to get us all to engage in some discussions about the different dimensions and maybe how much we emphasize them or don't emphasize them in our teaching, and what the costs and benefits of those trade-offs might be. Just to be sure we're all on the same page here, for those who aren't familiar with the framework, I'm going to put a link into the chat. And then I will share my screen. And I just want to get a feel for our audience today about how familiar people are with the framework. So let's see if I can share this screen. And then we've got how familiar are you, not familiar to very familiar. And I will launch a poll. And has that worked for everybody? Can you see it?
Not yet.
You
might have to say relaunch.
Relaunch poll. Anybody see it? All right, let's see what we end up with. I'll actually just put the results. Over here, we've got 16 of 16 participants. And we have ended up with number, well, with number 5 as the winner, as very familiar, with some people who are not familiar. So we'll just spend a moment to discuss the framework and what each of the dimensions are, so that we're all on the same page moving forward with today's talk. And so if you do use that link, you can go to the 4DEE framework page at ESA, and we can see our 4 dimensions listed here. We have core ecological concepts, ecological practices, human-environment interactions, and cross-cutting themes. So core ecological concepts is the one that everybody's pretty familiar with. It's basically the scales of ecology from organisms to the biosphere. And this is oftentimes how we see textbooks structured, right? You start with the small things and you work toward the big at the end of the book. And within this dimension, we have elements related to each of those levels that I just noted, from organisms to the biosphere. The second dimension is ecology practices. And so here we have things like natural history, field work, quantitative reasoning. I also like to put just scientific literacy into this bin, as well as general scientific understanding, designing, critiquing investigations, collaborative work, communicating and applying ecology, and so on. So that second dimension is our ecological practices. The third dimension are human environment interactions, or the way that humans interface with the environment and the consequences of that interface. So we've got human dependence on the environment, climate change, how humans manage and shape resources, as well as a part devoted toward ethics of the environment. And lastly, we have our fourth dimension, which is cross-cutting themes. If you look at this, is really a lot like vision and change. We've got things like structure and function, evolution, systems. So kind of overarching themes that we might see in biology in general, not just specifically to ecology. And so that's kind of our breakdown of each of these four dimensions. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Feel free to just shout them out. All right. So let's go ahead and go on to another polling question then. We're talking today about covering some things more, some things less. Which dimension is the most important? Or which one would you be the last to cut that you feel like you have to have in your course? So I'm going to end this poll and open up another poll. And which one's the most important of those four? You have to pick one, even if you love them all. All right, we've got 16 of 16 in, and I will just slide the results over here. The majority of us have said number one, core ecological concepts are the most important to us. And so let's kind of go ahead and perform this thought exercise then. What if we don't cover core ecological concepts in our course? We decide that's not important and that's not part of our curriculum for our course that semester. How would that impact students who take our course in both the short term and the long term?
I'm actually not sure you could even incorporate the other dimensions without this option. That would be like, you're not teaching ecology, you're teaching something else, in my opinion.
Other thoughts?
So I think it would be kind of like teaching environmental science.
Mm-hmm.
I think in many environmental science courses, they don't really get to the core ecological concepts as much as they should.
Yeah, I was thinking the same sort of thing when I teach ecology versus environmental science. Those core ecological concepts take a big back seat to those human environment interactions in that context. Other thoughts? No, you don't have to raise your hand. You can just shout out. We're a small enough group.
I was just trying to follow the rules.
There are no rules.
Okay. Well, I was thinking not so much like not covering things, I guess, but I was thinking of it more as which one of the four dimensions is your entry point. Because I think you could start with human environment interactions, but then to discuss certain human environment interactions, you would have to introduce certain ecological concepts. So I think they would be sort of like what I would sort of think of as just-in-time concepts. So that students are not necessarily getting all of them, but just in time, they're getting introduced to the ones that they need to understand those interactions.
So we kind of talked about it from the perspective of our class, but let's say you did it. Let's say you taught your ecology course without core ecological concepts. I agree with some of you. I'm not sure how you might do that, but what would that look like for students leaving your class and moving forward in their academic career?
I mean, I think it's like trying to speak a language without knowing the vocabulary. Like, it's not possible, right? I mean, I always, when I introduce the ecological concepts, I sort of say to them, this is like learning the language. You're being introduced to the vocabulary. So I don't know how you can speak the language if you're never taught the vocabulary.
Yeah, so even at that lower Bloom's level, right? They're just
Yeah.
out of the conversation to begin with because they don't know what the biosphere is or whatever our very basic vocabulary is. Yeah. Other thoughts on that one?
Hi. I think also what happens, and I see this with some of the students coming into college, they don't understand like the history behind certain things. And the core ecological concepts, you can really bring in some of the history and where we got, especially like with succession, because I've asked questions about, I had them read papers and they would say something that was way off. Because I feel like they're going by what is now, and oh, where biodiversity is being destroyed, this is this, and they're being told about climate change, but not understanding the history behind it. Like they really didn't take Odom's strategy of succession, I think that's the right title, well, because they thought, oh, this is the old paper, it doesn't make sense anymore, but it does. And so I think I had to like reteach that. So having the core ecological concepts is definitely really important.
Okay. Well, everybody voted for that as, oh, Lauren, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I just wanted to build on those past two comments because I agree that it's like learning a new language, but our students aren't blank slates. If we're focused on the undergraduate level, they are coming in with some knowledge of ecology and concepts, whether it be very simple about food chains, organisms, of course, they know. So I actually chose human environment interactions because I agree, as been hinted at before, that the core ecological concepts are embedded within those. So for me, it's a hierarchical thing where if we have to start or eliminate something, I'd rather eliminate the core ecological concepts because they're gonna get some of them indirectly when we're talking about human environment interactions, even if it's not explicitly. And also, there is some knowledge base already there at the undergraduate level. So I think the difference is if we don't cover core ecological concepts, they just won't become as sophisticated as we would like them to be in using the terms.
We've got.
Can I add something?
Mhm.
Oh, sorry. So I agree with Lauren. Basically, I also answered about the environment interactions. I think it depends on what you teach. Like in my case, I also teach biology for non-majors, and we only have a few classes on ecology. So I always wonder, well, what's important for a non-major in science to actually know, right? Do we need to learn the concepts, or do we need to focus more on the applications? So I have always had that question too.
All right, and we've added some rules to my lawlessness here based on Teresa's guidance. We are going to have hands up now. Rick, you were next in the queue.
Yeah, I'm in general, it comes down to, I think for all of us, it's sort of a false choice. We can't not cover one of these things, right? So it's not that you don't cover core ecological concepts, you just cover it in less depth, less detail. If you want to also talk about human environment interactions or cross-cutting themes. So, no one understands trade-offs better than ecologists. So it's a matter of not that you don't cover it, that you cover it in less depth, less detail. Environmental science, we cover core ecological concepts in half the detail, maybe, because you have to talk about energy, you have to talk about a lot of other things that aren't maybe in an ecological book. So I think it's really not that you wouldn't cover them. It's just that it's the depth. If you want to cover all four things, you cover each one with a lot less depth and breadth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've got Crystal.
To echo what Lauren had said before, he said something about doing things with the information, doing things with the core ideas. And I think that's why I prioritized the practices. If we want students to be ecologists, if we do more than just like know things about ecology, we do ecology, and that's where the practices come in. So I think if we forefront the practices, getting students to do the science, that can help explain the concepts. So for me, I think the practices, the actual doing science, getting students to like participate in the scientific process, for me, that was the most important one.
Yeah. So let's use that as a transition here. We kind of said, which one would you lose the most? Scientific practices or ecological practices was actually voted pretty low at 2. So a lot of people seem to think that's something that maybe is a little bit more expendable than some other items here. What if we didn't cover ecological practices? For example, I think a great way to look at this is, I know some people have a lecture and a lab or field work, and they say, well, that's where we cover that. And so imagine you lost that field component. How does your students end up if you fail to cover ecological practices in depth? Wendy?
Sorry. So I noticed that Crystal's in the same department as me at RIT, even though I'm officially now at Geneseo. But I taught ecology at RIT, and I did the lab portion because for 2 years, we because of COVID and other circumstances, the lab portion was lost. So what happened was the students coming into our BSMS students were lacking in basic ecological skills in the field. They knew some things, but not a lot. So it was really crucial for us to get those basic skills of plant diversity, understanding succession, understanding different concepts. So when they went to the upper level, so I actually did put down, I would not, that it was important for the second one to keep. Because I saw what was happening to our students when we had the lack of that hands-on experience in the lab. And you can do this in the classroom by using some data sets for teaching R and trying to understand like diversity or some other concept that could be easily taught alongside R.
Great. Lauren?
Just as a purely theoretical exercise, the way I would approach answering the question, if we don't cover ecology practices, is that they'll learn it when they need to use it. And in my particular class, it's helpful to give them practice, of course, so they can be better in the future. But if I don't cover something, if they never have to use it the rest of their lives, no harm, no foul. But they will need to learn it when they need to use it. And that's how I console myself when I have to skip things.
Ken?
So if I can make a confession, when I was an undergrad, I took a senior level course in ecology, but I didn't take the lab with it. And as I think about when I went off to graduate school, and then when I went into my career as a professor, I found it a little bit challenging to use some of the techniques that that many of my colleagues seem to be so facile with, so easy to use. So I do agree that ecology practices are important, and they really should be integrated in with any other course, or with an undergraduate course, simply because otherwise you're teaching ecological theory, and that's all the students are getting.
Lauren?
So Purdue's kind of weird in that they have this in-between class, Introduction to Ecology Evolution, that actually does not have a lab. And I teach it as an asynchronous class over the summer, so students don't actually have a lab portion that they do, but I incorporate a lot of like reading and interpreting graphs and doing data, and I don't do R because I feel like it's too hard to do asynchronously, but I have them do some stuff in Excel. So it does stink that they don't get any of like field stuff or experimentation in the lab, but if they do want to continue with ecology, they take other classes that do that. But I agree with everyone so far that it is obviously important for them to get that lab and field experience, but I think it is integral to and very easy to incorporate 3 through 6 within your lecture portions of your class in multiple different ways.
Yeah. And I feel similarly, Lauren, because I teach an ecology class that doesn't have a lab, and I use a lot of active learning to bring in those ecological practices into the classroom, so students are getting those graphing skills, basic data interpretation, experimental design, and things like that. I'll also add another thing here, that part of this depends on the audience, at least for me a little bit, and that's because oftentimes I'm teaching non-majors. And in some ways, those ecological practices, which represent scientific literacy, may be one of the most important learning objectives for a course, because you're supposed to be able to swap a student into ecology or chemistry or biology or physics and get that basic scientific literacy for a non-major that's going to take that with them moving forward down the road. And so in some ways, I think this is a really important dimension. And I don't know, from my perspective, it may be more important than ecological concepts, because we need scientifically literate people just to get through their daily lives effectively. So Rick?
Yeah, I would actually just build off of that. You know, one of the things that I hear from instructors around the country is the vast majority of their students are not future ecologists. You know, they're pre-med, pre-dental, pre-vet, et cetera. And that's the audience. So there's you know, that perspective of we're largely training people who you know, will be future informed citizens and have that scientific literacy. They'll have some knowledge about the environment, but you know, they'll get other ecological training in more advanced courses or in graduate school, et cetera, for those who want to go on. But maybe 80% or more are not destined to be ecologists. So it's worth thinking about, as someone said, who's the audience here, and how much do we want to really focus on the future ecologists versus everyone else who we really want to give scientific literacy in a broad form of understanding environmental issues.
Joey?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting because, well, when you guys are talking about the importance of field work, when because tomorrow I'm graduating, but when I was doing my was taking classes, I was also I started my undergrad when COVID started, and I had to take ecology classes, but they were all asynchronous. So there were some things where the professor was planning on doing field work, but we couldn't because it was COVID and it was asynchronous. And I recently just went on a seeds field trip where I was with a bunch of other undergrads, but they had already done a lot of field work in their classes, and they were going out into the field as opposed to just an online situation. And they took the class like a year before, but they still knew the information. And I think there's something important with ecology some things are so much more important hands-on, such as field work, because I think you attain the information a lot better when you're with like the plants and the animals and the data. So I think yeah, I think in terms of what you would like your students to leave with, it's sort of experience is a really big one.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. You're basically saying you can't function as an ecologist if you don't know how they do things. And maybe there's a world too where if you don't do that, that devalues the ecological concepts because you don't know how they arrived at those concepts that we're teaching them. And I think a couple of people brought this up. It brings up maybe an interesting natural experiment where we have a bunch of people that had reduced ecological practices education as a result of COVID. And there might be a world in which somebody could study that and figure out, you know, what was the long-term impact on those students who kind of missed out on that dimension of their education. Other thoughts on not teaching ecological practices? All right. Why don't we go ahead and jump to another one that was not favored as much again, and that is cross-cutting themes. What if we teach our students without cross-cutting themes? And I will say one thing that I've been guilty of for many years is I've always said cross-cutting themes are just kind of a bonus that you get because you're teaching other things and you can't not teach them. They just happen. Like you're going to have to talk about evolution at some point. But I think maybe one important way to consider it is the amount of emphasis you put on it, or how often you recognize that you are talking about a cross-cutting theme in your course. So what if we didn't explicitly call out those cross-cutting themes for our students? All right, if nobody's going to chime in, I'll say something to get the conversation going. Oh, we got George, who's going to.
So the cross-cutting themes, I think, is perhaps the most difficult to integrate of the four. And partly because, as you suggested, we don't pay particular attention to it. It becomes like a bonus if we happen to hook up and relate it to another course. And I think part of the difficulty in cross-cutting themes is that we don't necessarily relate it to the other courses that are offered in the curriculum. And it means actually paying attention to what your colleagues teach and what classes the students in your class have already taken, because you can't make that cross-cutting theme connection unless they've already taken the course. And honestly, I don't think we emphasize those themes sufficiently in the introductory level courses, so that by the time students arrive to your ecology class, they probably don't have much background that allows you to make those easy connections. And so I think that's the one, to me, that becomes the real problem. I think we'll get to HEI in a moment, I'm sure, but I think the concepts and practices in HEI are much easier to utilize. And I think, frankly, cross-cutting themes is just really, really a difficult beast.
Yeah. Crystal?
Yeah, we have cross-cutting themes in the K-12 science framework as well. And that covers the same thing, like systems and energy and structure and function. And it is so nebulous. It is so difficult for, like, in the K-12 system, for instructors to grapple with that. Because a lot of times we're doing these things incidentally and we're not actually calling them out. So this would be the one that I would drop. I think it's very amorphous. It's something that a lot of us as scientists think about. We can cross through these different concepts pretty easily, but to make it explicit to students is not something I think we are very good at bringing forward and using our knowledge in ways that make sense to students, to be explicit about, like, this is the structure, this is the function, and calling it out in that way. So this would be the one that I would drop if I had to drop one of the dimensions.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Crystal. Sheila?
Hi, yeah. So our introductory biology course is called Ecology, Evolution, and Biodiversity. So by the time students get to an upper level ecology course, they've had the evolution. And so when I think about what to drop, I can't think about dropping the whole thing if I were to drop this, because it seems like evolution is always present in our ecology classes. And, you know, kind of even linking selection and and obviously evolution, it's the adaptive change, but even linking it to mutations. And so like Ken and I are part of a group that look at video, the 40EE video group. And so we try to make these connections to try to make it easier to teach. And so you can make some of these connections, for example, with some of the HHMI videos. There's one about the birth and death of genes that's really great, that allows for that cross-cutting. So I think there's ways that we can make and bridge that gap, because I think the cross-cutting themes is the hardest to try to integrate in some ways, but I think it's possible. But I don't always get to all of the themes because there's so many different aspects, even within each sort of component of the framework. But I always try to incorporate evolution. But it's easy for me because I know my students have had some basics in it.
Great. Thanks, Ken.
So let me push back a little bit on this in terms of the cross-cutting things being so difficult. I don't know, maybe the way that I view cross-cutting themes, one theme would be energy. And so energy is something that you can talk about from the cellular level, excuse me, or community level, or the ecosystem level. And certainly it's something that I think is so central to those levels that I couldn't imagine teaching, let's say, ecosystem ecology without mentioning energy or energetics. And also scale, things like temporal scale, spatial scale, I think is also very important. And even, you know, when you're out in the field with a group of students and you're talking about succession, or you're talking about you know, some sort of spatial scale, I think that's a natural thing to talk about. So So I would be hesitant to list cross-cutting themes as something that we want to cut out.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Carmen?
Originally, I thought about cross-cutting themes as something to leave out, and then more and more I realized that what we needed to do more than anything was to have a period where we talked about categories of cross-cutting themes, just a couple of important ones. And this was reminded to me by the discussion about what teachers get. We prepare undergraduates to be science teachers or teach basic introductory science components at various grade levels, but we don't say, okay, energy is something you have to talk about. It doesn't matter what age group. And because it is a cross-cutting theme. And if we were to ask any of our undergraduates, list all the cross-cutting themes you've heard, you're lucky if you get one. So I would say we don't actually define it. Most of us have had a lab in the past, introduction to the microscope. Okay, and that's a basic lab that doesn't seem to be left out a lot and sometimes should. But certainly we never had a whole period of any kind of course component where we talked about what are these categories that are so important to understand interactions among all living things. And that may be the way to go. If you can't talk a lot about any one in detail, at least people will know what are things that they're all connected to.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Carmen. Erica?
Yeah, and kind of dovetail with what Carmen was saying about connections. So I was probably maybe n equals one of slim minority of people that chose cross-cutting themes is like the part of the upper yes, please, this choice. For two reasons. Mainly, well, kind of as a cheat, because I also see it as a way to sort of capture a lot of other topics. I mean, definitely things in the core ecological concepts, but also too, as like an organizer. So I actually very explicitly start my general ecology course thinking and talking about what a function is, what when we say structure, what do we think about, how we use, energy and matter as sort of overarching theme, and definitely evolution. Scale is a big idea. So I kind of see those, even though they might be hard to maybe detail and explicate throughout a course, it's valuable from the top down approach, I guess. And that's the part that sort of resonated with me.
Yeah, that's great. Is there anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak that has something to say or that they'd like to contribute as we're moving on? All right, I'm not seeing any hands there. Yeah, and this makes me think a little bit about what we talked about earlier with that non-majors environmental science class. How often are you going to cover cross-cutting themes? I mean, you're definitely going to get systems in there, but how much more or less valuable is it if you specifically call out that the carbon cycle is a system or that information is a system and so on? And so I think what we've all kind of coalesced on is that it's there, we cover it, but it's a matter of what Erica was saying, that intentionality of calling out that this is a dimension and that these different cost-cutting themes are important and perhaps where they apply throughout the semester.
Justin, there's a comment in the chat as well related to this question. So, are you suggesting that people do explicitly use the terminology cross-cutting themes? Sounds like that's what you're saying.
Well, a lot in the 4D community, there's been a lot of discussion going on around this, about this. And one idea I always had was like, could you brand your slide in a lecture with what dimensions you're covering in that activity or in that slide? And how valuable would that be to a student to know, oh, wow, we're talking about the carbon cycle. So that's a system. Or we're talking about evolution here because we're talking about life history traits and, explicitly pointing those sorts of things out. I think there's a world in which that's a best practice. But I also wonder, gosh, it's what it's like implementing another thing. Gosh. But it seems maybe perhaps low cost for high benefit, kind of a metacognition of 4DE, right? Like if a student goes into an ecology course with a knowledge of the framework, and then we call out the framework throughout the semester, it gives them this kind of metacognitive view of ecology through this four-dimensional lens. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox on that one now for a moment. Crystal.
So you mentioned bringing students into this. Do you know if there are any resources for onboarding students into 4DEE? Is there any way to like make this framework more approachable for students learning how to use this framework for their own thinking?
That would be a Teresa question. And I don't think anybody's done that as part of the FMN or their project. Like, what if we onboarded students into 4DEE? That's pretty cool. That's an amazing thought.
Well, you know, I think, remember Justin at the transforming ecology education to 4D project steering committee, and some of the members are here, Carmen, Ken are here as well, and Justin, you were part of that. That there is actually some growing interest in saying, you know, we need to do that. So, you know, that might be actually, you know, happening more sooner than we think. But, you know, right now we're just focusing on faculty, right? So, and you all have enough to give us work. So, but yeah, I think that's a good point. Thank you, Crystal.
Yeah, and then Carmen had a comment about just for future employers, if you're in an interview, you can say, I understand ecology from all these perspectives. And what if you just had 3 and somebody else had 4? They're going to win the interview, right? Because they got everything. So, Ken?
So I seem to recall actually this conversation coming up maybe 2 years ago. And I think I hope I'm not wrong, but I sort of remember actually putting together something and submitting it to EcoEd. And I think it's still hung up in review in EcoEd, if I'm not mistaken. You know, a little brochure for students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be great. Other thoughts? Okay. So so we've done 3 of them. Let's jump. We kind of already talked about human environment interactions a little bit earlier. We've got about 15 minutes left here. So let's talk about human environment interactions, and I have a couple more questions and a couple more things to consider. So what if we don't cover human environment interactions in our classes? And I think there's kind of some classic ways to think about this. That there was a long time where textbooks kind of said that's a different world. That doesn't live in what we're doing. And there are even instructors out there that kind of feel and think that way still. And so what if you teach an ecology course without human environment interactions? Lauren.
I have strong thoughts about this, mainly because when I was an undergrad in ecology, I didn't learn any human interactions at all. I was definitely a student of instructors that we just learned the ecological theory in like the pristine environment as if it were not interacted with humans. And then I, learned about toxicology and I got a master's in toxicology. And now all I think about is human environment interactions. And so I can't teach ecology without thinking about human environment interactions. And in the textbook I was using, it was actually like the last chapter was like how humans talk about the environment. And I explicitly told my students, no, we're bringing this all the way up to the first week of class, because the whole rest of the class, we're going to be referring back to, how we learn about it this way in like the pristine environment. Okay, and then what happens when humans come in and pollute or build bridges or, whatever. But I think it's really important. It's, again, really easy to you can teach concepts without it and then have students critically think about, all right, well, what are we doing as humans and how does that impact the different theories and concepts that they're learning?
Other thoughts? Ken.
So I think when we look at the ecological literature, one of the things that I happen to notice is that more recently, within let's say within the past 4 to 5 years, that there's most of the articles actually do reference some kind of human interaction, whether it's or some sort of human effect. So whether it's climate change or prescribed burning or overpopulation or whatever it is, there seems to be a much more greater tendency to tie whatever basic research you're doing into some applied aspect. And it's a phenomenon that I've seen, again, over the past 4 to 5 years, that maybe 15 or 20 years ago, if you looked at the ecological literature, especially those articles that might be published in ecology or ecological monographs, you know, they did discuss ecological problems apart from human interactions. But again, now the ecological literature is much more tied in to ecological interactions. So yeah, we need that also.
Carmen?
Yeah, I think the human environment interaction, I was just going to say that to get students engaged and doing some of the work in learning, this is one dimension in which you can say, part of your lab is for you to find out how human environment interactions are connected to this cross-cutting theme, let's say, or whatever that is already connected to the ecological concept that's being introduced in the lab or the lecture, so that they become, you know, practitioners and presenters of what they found. And that becomes a lecture period or a lab period or a discussion period, depending on how you have it structured. But I think this is where you can let them run with it. And to the point that they'll actually be the ones bringing up the concepts of traditional ecological knowledge, which we would normally leave out, but they would bring them up more readily. So.
All right. And Shamil?
Yeah, so I teach a non-majors environmental bio. And so I think, as you were saying earlier, Justin, when you're teaching non-majors, sort of understanding of certain things like scientific literacy, like all these things in sort of broad strokes becomes really important. And I sort of feel the same way about sort of human environment interactions, because really in my class, the students are not leaving my class with the intent of becoming professional ecologists, but I'm hoping that they're leaving with this understanding of the human space, or how humans fit into ecosystems. So I think when you're sort of thinking about like educating for the whole human, sort of students who have curious minds, can ask good questions, can think critically. I think human environment interactions are where you have to start, and then where the cross-cutting themes, I think, have to be embedded within them, and then the other aspects have to be brought in.
Yeah, so in some ways you just summarized a lot of what the non-majors working group has come up with. The idea that human environment interactions are super important for environmental science. They may actually be the focus, but even for non-majors ecology, they may be the hook, or what's most important to students because they see how it applies to their lives. And both Lauren and Erica are on that committee as well. George?
So am I, Justin. But
oh yeah, George is too.
but I think the key here, and I'm just going to echo some of the things that have already been said, but this is really, to me, the HEI component is really where the rubber meets the road, because we're teaching a group of students in each of the classes, very few of whom will go on to become professional ecologists, but all of whom will go on to be, we hope, active participants in making decisions about the world and dealing with the world's problems. And we know what those problems are in terms of the environmental issues, but what we don't have is an educated public that can respond in appropriate fashions to using and understanding and fostering the science needed to address these problems. And so that's really, to me, the purpose of all of the classes that I ever taught, is to get students involved and active in the decision-making and the policy processes moving forward as they go out and they become doctors and lawyers, or, I don't know, technicians, or waiters and waitresses, or whatever they do, but they'll still be active and have to deal with these issues. And if they understand it, then they can participate. And to get them to participate means they need to understand the impact in that interaction between humans and the environment itself. And so to me, this is really where this is the one core component that I think you cannot eliminate. It's no longer sufficient to have it as an add-on or the last chapter or in a box in a chapter about practices or core concepts. This has to be fundamental and has to underline and become essentially the vertebrae for all of the ecological classes and teaching.
Great. Thanks, George. Rick?
Yeah, so I really love the comments here. It struck me that some of us who took ecology decades ago, when you look at the ecology textbooks of that time, they intentionally left out human environmental interactions. If you look at Bob Rickliff's first edition of Economy of Nature, and in the preface, I remember reading this, that Bob wrote something to the effect of, you'll notice there's no applied ecology here. That's by intention, and that has no place in an introductory ecology textbook. Now that's written in the 70s. Many of us may have still been reading it in the 80s, but it's a real change. So people who have recently, in the last decade, taken ecology have probably been exposed to a lot more human environmental interactions than older folks, my generation and older, who were initially trained very differently. But I totally agree with what everyone's saying is, if you want to get the entire crowd interested and fascinated and caring about what's happening to the environment, it has to be a part of it.
Great. Thanks, Rick. All right, I'd like to turn the poll we had on its head earlier on just a minute as we're wrapping up here. I'll have one more point after this, but which dimension then is the least important based on our discussion that we had today? So now you've got to cut one. We kind of agree that it's problematic, but which one would you in fact choose to cut? And if I could get my, oh, I can't seem to get my, everybody can just type it in the, oh no, here's my poll. I can do it from over here. And poll, show results, close that poll, and more polls. Back. All right, so which one would you least, which one's the least important? Which one are you going to cut if you had to choose? You can't choose 5. That's cheating. That's probably the best answer because I kind of knew that's where we'd end up. But okay, we have all our answers in here, and it was a tie between 2 and 4. Oh no, 2 seems to be winning. So ecological practices. I'm surprised it's not cross-cutting themes, but that's really interesting, and some great information there. I'd like to bring up one more thing. We've been talking about these dimensions in isolation, and people kind of beat me to this one because I kept mentioning this term integration. And the reason why the logo looks the way it does is because if you look at ecological practices, it's in conjunction with human environment interactions, it's in conjunction with ecological concepts, and cross-cutting themes is going through there too. And the idea is that while these are independent dimensions, there's a world in which they can be integrated with each other in education. And so following on our theme of what happens to a student if we don't teach one of the dimensions, what if we teach them all, but we don't integrate them? We just have a class that's human environment interactions, or we just have a section, or we just talk about ecological concepts and scientific practices separately. How might a lack of integration influence the final outcome for students? Lauren.
I would say that without integration, because we talked a lot about how helping students make connections throughout the course. And I think without integration, we would be doing our students a disservice because we would be hindering their ability to make connections between material.
Other thoughts? Crystal.
Yeah, if we don't integrate, it feels like we might end up in the same place where we see a lot of intro bio courses where it's just like a whole breadth of facts. And if we don't integrate any of them, I think students walk away from science feeling like they know a lot, but they don't know what to do with those facts. They just know a lot of discrete pieces of information about biology and ecology.
Great. We've got Shamil.
Yeah, so I sort of think that what we often forget is that students need learn from modeling. And I think, I think a lot of college where we expect students to take courses in discrete disciplines and for themselves to just understand how sociology might connect to ecology, that nobody ever makes the explicit connection for them, but they are supposed to make it on their own. I think we need to model for them how various things integrate with each other. So I think that if we don't integrate, then they're just going to sort of understand all of this content in sort of silos and not really see the connections, let alone within ecology, but between ecology and other disciplines.
Thank you. Erica?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see ecology as the ultimate transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary connectivity topics. And so it feels weird to even think about whether we have the model in front of us or not. I think trying to think about a world that exists in which we don't look at those connections doesn't even feel like it's the same course or topic anymore. And then I wondered, for those of you that are out there in a time either before NGSS, if you do K through 12 stuff, or a time before Vision and Change, like what did the beginnings of those models in your classroom space look like for you? So did you have, I'm just kind of curious, like if you saw yourself already integrating and then those models were like, yep, I knew it, I've been doing it right all along, or if this was a time for you to sort of refocus your efforts on that. So I was just curious if you want to kind of add some things in the chat or whatever makes sense. Justin, don't mean to railroad, but just curious.
Great. Yeah. If folks want to think about that, talk in the chat. We'll let folks think if they want to respond. We'll let Ken pop in. He was next in line.
Okay, so one of the things, again, I'm confessing certain things right now, and so the other confession I have is that as I went through my career, I just recently retired, but I'm still teaching a little bit. I don't really know what my other colleagues are teaching. It just seems that we don't really share syllabi, and sometimes we don't really have a discussion about what we're doing, especially between departments, between like chemistry and biology, or biology and environmental science. And so just as an example, in this energy course that I'm teaching, I incorporated a bonus question that related to the sustainable development goals, the SDGs of the UN. And I thought, oh, I'm really clever that I'm introducing students to the Sustainable Development Goals. And then a couple of students responded that they saw that in another course. And so it surprised me that somebody else is teaching this. And the students are seeing us teaching each other, or us teaching similar things, but yet we're in isolation from each other as professors. I don't know. This is what happened to my school. I don't know whether this is common at other schools.
George, we got to wrap up here pretty soon. We just have a couple minutes left. So
you're not going to let me make a comment?
No, I'm saying make a comment, keep it brief, and then I can kind of wrap up this section and then wrap up the meeting as a whole.
I've been thinking a lot about, confessional, Ken, my career, and the fact that I actually team taught a course that was with a colleague in political science. And the fact that because of that, I started to incorporate more consideration of policy in my ecology. And I noticed that he too started to incorporate more environmental issues in his policy classes, his regular standard intro policy classes. And I would encourage people to do that, because I think what we need to do is shift out of this multidimensional 4DEE multidimensional thought pattern and think of it as more as 4DEE interdimensional, because we need to start to blend those dimensions together. So when, for instance, you teach a core practice, and somebody alluded, and my apologies, I don't remember who, said that it would be really useful to talk about the practices that allowed the development of that particular concept to emerge. And I think that weaving those two together gives students a fuller appreciation of both dimensions than just simply talking about a practice independent of what that practice informed the earlier ecologists or previous generations. And so I think trying to weave those together and weave together what those then practices might lead and might use to direct human environment interactions, or might even relate to cross-cutting themes. I think this interdimensionality is where we really need to start moving toward. And Justin, thank you.
Yeah. And so my last thoughts on this, I agree. It may be a multiplicative interaction rather than just additive. The idea is that you get more out of teaching your core ecological concepts when there's ecological practices involved. And so one thing that I really concentrate on in my teaching is using active learning to bring in to what's basically a course oriented around those ecological concepts into each lecture, those practices in human environment interactions. And it sounds like it might take a lot of time, but really what I'm doing is, while I'm teaching about that human environment interaction, students are also learning about those ecological practices at the same time. And so there's a world in which I think integration is incredibly important, and perhaps a tool by which it's easier to cover all of the dimensions. When somebody says, I don't have time to do this, what am I going to do? Well, perhaps by integrating, you do have the time. So that's kind of my note on integration. And I think everybody kind of knew this was a false setup from the beginning. All 4 dimensions were important, but I think it was a useful framework by which to discuss each of these dimensions and that importance to have fully formed and well-rounded students. And I think in the end, we all agree that we need all 4. They probably need to be integrated, but we do make choices during our classes about what we emphasize and don't emphasize. And maybe hopefully for the people watching now or watching this video later, there can be some thought given to how a course is structured, given these kind of considerations for the importance of each dimension. That's all I have for today. I'll hang on. There's a couple more minutes left if folks want to chat or have any questions or anything like that. But that is the end of our official discussion for the day.